Hey, Rockin' readers, are you ready for the conclusion of our Flat Stanley worldwide adventures of Mount Rushmore Calamity? We're starting back with chapter 5. And if you remember, they just got out of the cave-in and Gold Rush was missing. So, chapter 5 on the trail. Must have been a spook by the cave-in, Calamity moaned. I'll have to track him before he gets too far. The boys kept a safe distance behind. Calamity didn't seem in any mood for their company. Now and then they heard her muttering, "Gol darn show-offs!" and they dropped back even farther. Stanley and Arthur felt miserable. They had been show-offs, and they knew it now. After a while, Calamity gave a little whoop and ran into a clearing. There stood Gold Rush, snorting and lathered in sweat. The cowgirl threw her arms around her horse. "Let's get you some water, feller," she said. Calamity looked around. "We're a ways off from the stream," she worried out loud, "and I don't see any signs of a spring." "I can help. I have an idea," Stanley cried. Calamity shot him a look that said... That said what? I can't get the page to turn. That said she'd heard about enough from him. But Stanley did indeed have an idea. He lay down in the grass in front of Gold Rush and curved himself into the shape of a trough. Look at that. "Pour in some water from the canteens," he directed Calamity. Calamity did, and then Stanley held very still as the horse's big lips came right down and slurped from his belly. It tickled, but Stanley Lambchop did not move, and he did not spill one drop. When Gold Rush had finished drinking, Calamity helped Stanley to his feet. She wore a big grin as she shook his hand. "Maybe I was wrong about you, partner," she said. "Any friend of my horse is a friend of mine." "So you're not angry with us anymore?" asked Arthur. "Shucks, no. I reckon you two aren't half bad for a couple of greenhorns. Now I better fix us some grub. We're lost, partners. We're going to have to figure out how we get home from here. A cowboy can't think on an empty stomach." Calamity Jasper pulled a can of beans and a pot from her saddlebags. She built a fire, and soon the beans were rubbling cheerfully in the pot. "Cowboys always carry beans for emergencies," she said. Arthur made a mental note to carry beans with him from now on. "How did you learn to be a cowboy?" he asked Calamity. "How'd you learn to follow tracks like that? We didn't see anything, but you followed right to Gold Rush." "Following tracks isn't a cowboy skill. I'm part Lakota Sioux," Calamity said proudly. "We Native Americans know lots of useful things, like which plants make medicine, and how to hunt and fish, and how to use, whoa, doggy, smoke signals." Calamity jumped to her feet. She ordered Arthur to gather a load of tumbleweeds. When he returned, she piled the tumbleweeds onto the campfire. Immediately, a dark, thick smoke streamed upward. "What about a blanket?" Stanley asked. "Don't you need a blanket for smoke signals?" Calamity grinned. "That's where you come in, partner." Both boys understood at once. Arthur picked up Stanley's feet, and Calamity took hold of his arms. Together, they flapped Stanley over the fire, sending puffs of thick smoke into the clear air. Stanley bravely held his breath and didn't cough once. Before too long, they heard a rustling in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. The tour group. "We saw the signals," Calamity's father said. "Came to see what you youngsters were here up to." "Looks like we're here up there in the real Wild West this time," said George Lambchop. "What a trip, eh, boys?" What chapter are we on now? Chapter 6, Around the Campfire. The children were grateful to follow the tour group back along the trail. As they crested Mount Rushmore over Lincoln's face, the boys walked to the edge to take a look. The repair crew had done an excellent job. The crack was barely visible. Stanley stepped out even further. "See, Arthur," he boasted. "See? Having a hard time with these pages today. I can too stand out here." But just then a sudden gust of wind caught Stanley by surprise, and it swept him off his feet, and he went skittering down Lincoln's steep forehead, coming to rest on the bridge of Lincoln's long nose. Stanley held on for dear life. He looked around. Far, far above him, he saw Arthur looking terribly worried, and suddenly he was very glad his brother had brought his authentic cowboy gear with him. "Arthur," he cried, "throw down your lasso." Arthur uncoiled his lasso and swung it around and around, aiming. Then he let go, and the rope went sailing out into the South Dakota sky and landed right in front of Stanley's outstretched hand. Calamity Jasper gave Arthur an admiring nod. "Mighty fine twirling, buckaroo," she applauded. "Mighty fine." Stanley grabbed hold of the rope and tied it around his waist. "Bring me up, Arthur," he called. Just then another gust of wind blew across the mountain. It lifted Stanley Lambchop up like a kite, up and up until the lasso was stretched taut. Stanley flew high up above the tour group. "Boys," Mrs. Lambchop called when she saw what was going on, "quit that horsing around." Now, dear, the boys are just having a bit of fun, Mr. Lambchop said. It's their vacation, too. After all, I don't see the harm. I suppose you're right, George, Mrs. Lambchop said. Still, I noticed Stanley smelled strongly of smoke, and that is not good for a growing boy. I'd like him to come back to camp and change his clothes. Arthur, reel your brother now, please. When Stanley was back on Earth, Mr. Lambchop invited Calamity to join them for a cookout. After a delicious meal of hot dogs and hamburgers, Mrs. Lambchop said, I believe the celebration calls for s'mores, to cheers all around. While they were toasting the marshmallows, Stanley and Arthur apologized for causing so much trouble in the mine earlier. Also, we're sorry you didn't find any gold, Arthur said. You have nothing to show for all the time in the mine. Well, that wasn't exactly so, partner, Calamity said with a grin. She dug into her pocket and produced a large, gleaming gold nugget. I found it in my boot. Reckon it fell in during the cave-in. Real gold, breathed Arthur. Can I hold it? You can do more than hold it, partner, said Calamity Jasper with a mysterious smile. You got a hammer? Arthur fetched the hammer they had packed to pound in the tent stakes. Calamity placed the nugget on a flat rock and brought the hammer down hard, cracking it into 3 chunks of gold. She gave one to Stanley and one to Arthur. They're yours. You earned them, she said to the brothers. Way I see it, without the cave-in, I wouldn't have had the gold in the first place. And without you, there wouldn't have been no cave-in. And with that, Calamity Jasper mounted her trusty steed, waved goodbye, and rode off into the sunset. Chapter 7. There's no place like home. The next day was the last day of their vacation. Calamity was off at a rodeo, and the Lambchops were making the park as a family. Many interesting activities filled the day, but Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop noticed the boys seemed subdued. It's the lack of fresh vegetables and fruits, Mrs. Lambchop fretted back at the campsite that afternoon. I dare say you're right, dear, said Mr. Lambchop. You know the boys so well. Just as they were packing up, a park ranger strode into their camp. Why, hello there, Bob, Mrs. Lambchop greeted him, remembering how he felt about his name. Hello, Lambchops all, Ranger Bob said. Sure sorry to see you folks go. We've had a grand time, Mr. Lambchop said, worth every penny of our admission fees. That's what I'm here about, said Bob. Your brave son Stanley paid his fee like everyone else, and given what a hero he was, something doesn't seem right about that. I'm here to refund that fee with the park's gratitude. Excuse me, Stanley interrupted politely, but my brother was a hero too. If it weren't for him being out there, I would have never grabbed onto the face of that rock. I can see how that is, agreed the ranger. 2 heroes, 2 refunds it is. Then Ranger Bob personally affixed the Mount Rushmore State Park sticker to the rear window of the Lambchop's car and bade them a safe trip home. Mrs. Lambchop looked into the car, overstuffed once more. I'm sorry, boys, but no, said Stanley. Arthur can have the space. You can mail me home. I don't mind. So the Lambchops drove to the nearest post office and slipped their elder son into a large mailing envelope, along with the rest of the graham crackers, a slice of American cheese, and a deck of cards. Insurance? Asked the postmaster. Mr. Lambchop chuckled as if the postmaster had made a joke. No need. There's no finer postal system in the world. I say if you can't trust the U.S. Postal Service to deliver a package safely, then whom can you trust? Look at him getting ready to get the mailbox. Mrs. Lambchop asked that the envelope be marked fragile, but Stanley was horrified at that suggestion. He did allow the postmaster to stamp do not bend, however. And then the 4 Lambchops made their way home from South Dakota, 3 of them in a car and 1 in a postal truck and a plane. Stanley arrived home first, refreshed by his restful trip, and helped unpack the car when his weary family appeared. It's always good to get away, said Mrs. Lambchop with a sigh, but it's always good to get back home. Then Stanley and Arthur hurried to their room to unpack while their parents tended to the stack of mail that had piled up. Arthur pinned the newspaper article about them up on the bulletin board. Brother Heroes, read the headline above a photo of the boys smiling with their arms around each other. You know, Stanley, he said, I don't think I've ever thanked you for what you did, becoming a bridge for me to cross over. Well, I didn't thank you either for lassoing me when I fell down the mountain, Stanley replied. He unpacked the 2 gold nuggets and placed them on the bookcase. Brotherhood is more important than gold. Right, agreed Arthur, and it's more important than any girl, too, even a cowgirl. Right, said Stanley, brothers above all. Boys, there's a postcard here, Mrs. Lambchop's voice interrupted them. It's from Calamity Jasper. For me? Stanley and Arthur each cried at the same time. It's addressed to Cowpoke Lambchop, their mother called out. I'll leave it here in the hall. In their haste to see whom it was for, Stanley and Arthur, their brothers above all, trampled each other running out of the room. The end. So then, I like these books because in the back it gives you a little bit of information about the setting where the story took place. So, what you need to know to be a Black Hills gold miner. Here's some true facts. Native Americans have lived in the Black Hills for more than 9,000 years. Some Lakota believe the Black Hills are the sacred center of the world. The Black Hills Gold Rush began in 1874 when Colonel Custer led 1,000 men into the western part of South Dakota to investigate reports that the area contained gold. That's the same Custer who later had his last stand against Sitting Bull at the Battle of Little Bighorn. One of the most famous cowgirls of the Black Hills was named Calamity Jane. She was a good friend of the famous lawman Wild Bill Hickok. Gold was first discovered in the Black Hills just a few miles from where Mount Rushmore was later built. Some would-be miners get tricked by fool's gold, which looks a lot like the real thing. If you want to tell the difference, try pressing your fingernail into the surface. If it leaves a small indent, you found gold. And the heads on Mount Rushmore are as tall as a 6-story building. If you match them with bodies, the men with those heads would be 3 times as tall as the Statue of Liberty. And that is the end. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Check out more Flat Stanley books. You can find them on Overdrive and Libby if you'd like to look and read them online. Or check them out when we open back up. See you later. Bye.